was to kind of talk through what is the current federal politics in terms of who our new leadership is, what is our current state politics and new leadership, and then to talk through what we saw as kind of some of the hot button issues that are getting a lot of interest in terms of the different topics that are getting policy interest, everything from COVID response to competition issues to conservation. And my hope is that we can make this kind of a back and forth discussion with myself, Terry, and John, but then also all of you as well. I think that we're all hoping for kind of an informal conversation. And if you have thoughts or questions as we go along, we're definitely going to have time for those at the end. But don't hesitate to speak up or have some thoughts along the way. So I'll start with kind of talking about the federal politics, where we stand. I think most of us are pretty well aware. We've got a new president, but a new president that is a well-known entity in President Biden. Obviously, the former vice president under President Obama, and our new Secretary of Ag, who's now been confirmed, is another well-known entity as well. Secretary Vilsack actually served in that role for 8 years under the Obama administration. So someone that many see is probably going to be a pretty steady hand. I listened to his confirmation hearings with quite a bit of interest. I think that he was polished and careful to not show too many of his cards, but I think certainly somebody who knows USDA well and plans to hit the ground running in terms of his role there at USDA. Catherine Tai, our new U.S. trade representative, is also a pretty well-known entity and somebody who is saying the right things already. In terms of Congress, we've got really, really narrow margins in Congress. Democrats are going to have a small majority in the House. At the moment, that's going to be a majority of 219 to 211. We've got 5 vacancies built in there. But it's going to be an 8-9 person majority in the House. In the Senate, we're even more closely divided with a 50-50 Senate. And I think, as most of us have probably become aware of, if we weren't already, that means that in the event of a 50-50 vote under the Constitution, our vice president will come in and serve as that dividing vote as a tiebreaker. And so if we're strictly along party lines, we're going to see the Democrats winning a majority vote in the Senate, but not having the 60 votes they would need to kind of run every procedural vote that they might have to. And so that'll be interesting to see how they're able to try and build coalitions to get to 60 votes when needed. From an ag perspective, I think that we've seen as much change as we really have in recent years from a leadership role perspective. Obviously, Chairman Pat Roberts of Kansas retired at the end of 2020, but so did House Ag Committee Ranking Member Mike Conaway, Republican from Texas, and then House Ag Committee Chairman Colin Peterson, a Democrat from Minnesota, lost his 2020 reelection bid. So of what I would call the 4 primary, ag legislators, your chair people and ranking member of the ag committees on the House and the Senate side, we lost 3 of our 4. Between those 3 leaders, that was 86 years of congressional experience. That is super, super significant. And not just congressional experience, but congressional experience from some members that were really focused on agriculture policy. And I think that those were all pretty big losses. Terry, I think you or John might have added in some commentary as we were working on our background here document about, we've seen a lot of change recently, but we've got quite a few retirements coming up as well, signaled, for 2022. Did you want to make any comments about that?
Yeah, that was me, Chelsea. Good evening, everyone. I think if you're looking ahead a bit to the next cycle, we've already seen Rob Portman, Roy Blunt, Pat Toomey, Richard Burr, and Richard Shelby announce their intent to not seek re-election. So all of those folks, and those are senators. There are more coming in the House. And there are a couple of others. Grassley from Iowa would be another one who's kind of rumored, but hasn't made an announcement yet as well. all of those folks would have had significant input and influence on ag and rural issues in their respective roles in the U.S. Senate. So continuing to watch those, I think it signals an ongoing transition in ag policy and leadership for the country as we head into the next election cycle.
Which I think puts all of us, both as your, association staff and lobbyists, but also as leaders, within farm and rural world, that puts us in a position of having to do a lot of education. That our average consumer is a couple generations removed from the farm. Our average legislator, I would like to look at data on this, probably more than a couple generations removed from the farm, at least at the federal level at this point. So I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks doing meet and greet Zooms with some of our new members of Congress that are getting added to the committees. We've got a lot of raw talent there. I think Tracy Mann from Kansas, from the Big First, getting on the Ag Committee, that was a big win. He's one where I always like starting conversations where I don't have to start with, what is a livestock auction? But there are a lot of conversations that do start that way, both with members of Congress and their staff. Probably the new committee addition that is getting the most questions or eyebrows raised is going to be Cory Booker. He's not a new member of Congress, but he is a senator from New Jersey that got added to the Agriculture Committee. I listened to an interview that they did with him the other day where he was asked, you are the first vegan on the Senate Ag Committee, what do you think that means and what are your priorities? And he had kind of a cute response where he said, well, actually, I think I'm the first vegan in the Senate, so I've been the first vegan on every committee on which I have served. That being said, I think the fact that he's serving on the Ag Committee has rightfully raised some concerns, especially as he has expressed a lot of concerns about animal agriculture and concentrated animal feeding in particular, and some of the bills we've seen him run in the past. I don't think that means that those sorts of thought processes are going to win the day necessarily, but they're certainly going to have an opportunity to be inserted into conversations where they weren't previously inserted. And that's something that we're looking at for the foreseeable future. In terms of who is our new leadership, we mentioned those that had rolled off the committee. Our new chairperson for Senate Ag Committee is going to be Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow, a Democrat from Michigan. She actually would have chaired that committee from 2011 to 2015 and had served as the ranking member, the lead Democrat, under Senator Pat Roberts' chairmanship over the last couple of years. So definitely a known entity. She has mentioned that trade, stability, climate, and gearing up for the 2023 Farm Bill are kind of her priorities, the things that she sees as her focus areas. Our new ranking member on the Senate side is Senator Bozeman of Arkansas. Senator Bozeman has a long history serving on the Ag Committee. He likes to joke that he might be the only senator who can breed his own cows. He's AI certified. He does come from a state, though, that's a little bit more diverse in its agriculture, has cotton and some other crops that play a bigger role in Arkansas ag than maybe we've seen be at the focus area of the Senate Ag Committee in the past. They've got a real diversity of agriculture in Arkansas, and so I think we'll see that in some of his priorities. On the House side, we've got Representative David Scott, a Democrat from Georgia, who's going to be the chairman. He has served on the Ag Committee previously. He does not come from a rural area in Georgia. He comes from the Atlanta area, but has a lot of interest in feeding programs, the food side of agriculture, and also has been very, very clear that the top priority under his gavel is going to be racial equity. And we've already seen that play out in some of the hearings we've seen and some of the priorities we've seen moving forward, really in just the first 100 days of this new Congress. So that's what our new leadership looks like on the federal level. I think John might be willing to share what we're looking like in Topeka in terms of some of our key players there.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. I'll kind of run through the makeup of the House and the Senate and kind of where we are politically and what that has created. for Kansas politics. While at the federal level, the elections, at least on the Senate and the presidency, skewed Democratic, while the House went more to the right. Kansas at the state level maintained the status quo and slightly moved to the right regarding the Republican Democratic mix. However, the primary election in August really definitely skewed right for the Republican caucus. So what we have is the Senate maintained their strong supermajority, veto-proof majority, and the House was able to actually gain a few when many people were expecting them to lose, the Republicans to lose seats. They actually went over the edge and had a stronger veto-proof majority with a more conservative caucus. So what you've seen on the House side, the leadership team actually stayed the same. And while that leadership team is made up, it's Ron Reichman is the speaker, Dan Hawkins from Wichita is the majority leader, and Blaine Finch is Speaker Pro Tem. They've all been really friendly to agricultural interests, willing to listen and willing to work through our issues. So we were excited to have them come back. In fact, the Speaker is back for an unprecedented third 2-year term as Speaker, which is the first 3-term Speaker in the history of the state, as far as I know. The Senate side, the leadership over there was that they did not run for re-election, the president or the majority leader. There was a strong race for the president and majority leader seats, but ultimately, what I would say that probably the very conservative members of the Senate Republican caucus became the president, Ty Masterson, president from Wichita, and oddly enough, the majority leader also is from the Sedgwick County area. So there's some details happening there at the moment, but we had 2 Sedgwick County legislators take the top 2 positions in the Senate, and then the Senate Vice President, the next powerful position in the Senate, went to another Central Kansas Senator Rick Wilborn. So that definitely skewed conservative, and the Senate already had extremely conservative leadership, but I think that they now have a strong majority of what I would call center-right senators. There's very few moderate senators in the Republican caucus. The way I like to explain how much more conservative the Senate became is that the Senate minority leader, which is the minority party is the Democrats, she was a Republican 2 years ago. That's how far right we've got. The minority leader is being led by a former Republican. I mean, so it's far to the right. So at the same time, we have, you have the dynamics of the politics at the national level, and I'm probably ad-libbing a little bit here in a recorded Zoom conversation that's going to be on the interwebs forever is dangerous. But I do think we also have a Democrat governor who I view as a legislator was a very moderate legislator and has been very good to work with throughout time and even in her first 2 years as governor. But there is also national pressure on any Democratic governor to push the national agenda. So we've got that dynamic happening on the second floor, and we have the opposite dynamic happening in both chambers. Let's just say it's leading to some interesting conversations that are occurring, and it will be interesting as we wrap up the session here. It's just a matter of how many bills a veto-proof legislature wants to send on to the governor to see whether she will sign them, let them become law, veto them, and pick those fights. So that's the real dynamic that we're fighting here, or not fighting, that we're dealing with here at the state level. As far as committees go, they did form on the House side. They formed a House Water Committee again, and they've been looking at it's really just doing a deep dive into water policy. I have to give kudos to Chairman Ron Highland there. I think he's done a good job of just getting all of the information out there, and we'll see where the discussion leads us next year. I think where it will likely lead is some discussions on how to combine or make agencies more efficient. I don't know that will be a successful endeavor, but it will be an endeavor nonetheless. And then behind the scenes on all of this, we already have the 2022 gubernatorial election happening. Essentially, we have I think there's 2 candidates that I know have officially announced or quasi-officially announced. Former Governor Jeff Collier and current Attorney General Derek Schmidt have both announced they are exploring the idea, at the least, of running for governor. And they're trying to determine who will be the standard bearer that will battle or go up against Governor Kelly in the general election in 2022. And that leads to a lot of different dynamics and positioning, especially in the post-Trump environment of politics. And it creates some interesting situations under the dome. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot view of the politics, as best as I can tell them on a recorded Zoom call.
Well, I think that lays a good groundwork to think about, okay, here's the politics we're dealing with. Now, what are some of the policies and what are some of the ideas, both on the federal and the state level, that are gaining some traction? I think that everything today kind of still has a COVID undertone as we're looking at policies, particularly on the federal level. While it's clear that climate change and some other things are kind of the big picture, long-term goals of this new administration, that they believe that COVID-19 response continues to have to be front and center. So that obviously means vaccine rollout. We've seen and that's a state by state deal, but we've seen packing plant employees in most every state who want to be vaccinated have been able to be fully vaccinated. And we're getting to the point in Kansas where in most Kansas counties, you're seeing vaccine offered to agriculture workers in general. Johnson County, where I live, is probably the one that's a little bit behind most, but from a rural perspective, most counties are offering to ag workers in general. We did see a pretty massive COVID relief bill pass earlier this month. It provided payments to individuals and many other things. Didn't have quite as many agriculture provisions as some of our previous COVID bills, or in particular did not include some of the direct payments that some of our previous COVID bills did. One thing this bill in March did do, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, is it did provide $4 billion with a B. We're billion and trillion a lot these days. They're pretty big price tags, but $4 billion of debt forgiveness for socially disadvantaged farmers. And socially disadvantaged was deemed to be racial groups that had been disadvantaged previously, in particular African American, Hispanic, and Asians, and a couple of Native Americans. Up to 120% of their USDA loans can be forgiven in this $4 billion worth of debt relief. There's also $1 billion in outreach and support for socially disadvantaged producers, and then $3.6 billion in food purchases and distribution efforts for pandemic response. That really makes up the majority, more than 75% of the agriculture provisions of this most recent COVID bill that passed this month. I'm getting a lot more questions about the COVID bill that passed clear back in December, because that's the COVID bill that includes additional coronavirus food assistance program payments that we have not yet seen rolled out. Secretary Vilsack was speaking to an event I attended virtually yesterday, an AgriPulse Summit, and he said that to expect an announcement within about a week on the CFAP payments that have been frozen. There's really kind of two different buckets here. There are those commodities that have previously received payments. Those are crops like barley and corn and sorghum and soybeans, cotton, all classes of wheat, and livestock. That's one group that is set to be receiving CFAP payments once again. There's also a group of producers that have not received payments before, things like contract poultry and pork producers. The secretary indicated yesterday that there will be an announcement made, he said, within about a week or so on what those payments look like in that rollout. He indicated that for those entities that had received payments before, they might be able to work under the structure of some of those USDA rules that have previously been provided. And therefore, they might be able to roll those pieces out a little bit quicker for those livestock and crops that have seen payments under CFAP 1 and CFAP 2 versus those entities that are going to be getting payments for the first time. He indicated that's going to be a new rulemaking and might take a little bit of extra time. But I took note that he said within a week. We'll see if we see that later this week or early next week or not. John, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the state level COVID things we're continuing to see?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I don't think there's not a lot of ag specific items. We did work through the first CARES Act funding for some broadband development, and we're successful in getting, Terry, not a shake your head no if I'm wrong, but I think it was $51 million that we ended up getting allocated for those projects.
John, I think it was 61 million. You're close.
Sorry, what's $10 million in this environment, right? So anyways, we were successful in getting in that, and I think have had some good results from that. Sadly, that on the broadband discussion, it's just a large investment that we have to make, and even $61 million only gets so many projects done. But we were successful in doing that, and I'm very pleased with the end result of that, and we'll continue to beat the broadband drum. Really, as far as the state level goes, the legislature and the governor were able to just reach an agreement on the Kansas Emergency Management Act revisions that they wanted to do. They were essentially, from an ag perspective, there was one version that was floating around that Dr. Brown might shudder when he hears this, but they were getting rid of some of the powers for animal and plant disease outbreaks that we'd worked to put in there back in, I think, 01 or 02, if I remember. And I think they were well intentioned, but at the end of the day, we weren't convinced that they needed to be changed. So the ag lobby was successful in getting that provision put back into the deal that was cut, and we're pleased with that. But the big topic, the major topic, is the unemployment insurance trust fund, and how that's the twofold problem there. You've got the people that are unemployed that are trying to get unemployment in their unemployment insurance that can't get, they just aren't getting the money. And then you have the people, like, I'll just use myself as an example. I have a business with two other partners, and two of us have been filed on fraudulently. One of us, myself, has been filed on twice fraudulently. So the Department of Labor has been working through on both fronts on battling those issues. And there's going to be some major reform there. I think there were some technological issues. It's a massive, massive problem, and everybody's pointing the fingers at everybody else. Of course, it is politics, but it's something that I am hopeful that we'll able to get resolved. There's reports of $1 billion, at least hundreds of millions of dollars of fraudulent claims that have been paid out, and to what they suspect are foreign entities, scammers, and the business community is wondering how is that going to get paid for. So those are the two major issues that we've been dealing with, and then obviously just dealing with COVID itself as we went into the legislative session, which we could talk about here in a little bit. I know that's one of the questions that we have, dealing with legislators virtually versus personally, but I'll defer to that discussion for a little bit later, unless you want to now, Chelsea.
I'm just a little bit curious, John, because I'm not in Topeka day in and day out. Does it physically look different? What is the amount of access that either lobbyists have or constituents would have in Topeka this session?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll jump into it now. So good segue. I would say, so first off, we have to give kudos to House and Senate leadership and legislative administrative services. They have so far, and it's looking fairly good data wise, they have been able to maintain a continued legislative session, which if you'd have told me the second week of January they were going to be able to do, I would have told you were crazy. The first few weeks was mostly virtual. You could go to committees, but you went in there as a lobbyist and you felt like half of the crowd was wondering, why are you wearing that mask and so scared of this thing? And the other half of the crowd was like, how dare you come in here and risk making me sick? So I just avoided the place, quite frankly. There were technology concerns. Hiccups, I would say. They'd invested a lot in technology to have all of their meetings virtually. And the first few weeks were frustrating, I think, for everyone. But I would say about 3 weeks ago, it started from a lobbying perspective, it started feeling more normal. And you could have conversations with people as you were walking through the halls, et cetera. Honestly, from a lobbyist perspective, it's been kind of nice because we don't have third grade field trips going through the building. So it's a lot quieter and you can actually hear during those conversations. But I would say the feel and every legislative session has its own feel. And I think it's getting back to normal as far as the conversations go, which is important. I mean, doing it virtually, and Chelsea, I don't know how you guys can do it in DC, but doing it virtually, it's doable and it's great to have that option, but there are just times where you have to go meet someone and look them in the eye and tell them, well, sometimes you tell them what they don't want to hear. Sometimes they tell you what you don't want to hear, but that interaction is very important for what we do. So it's been unique. Like I say, kudos to the legislative leadership for getting us to this point in the session. But that's kind of how the interaction has gone.
I think that's interesting. As John alluded to, DC is much more locked down than that still, to the point where most staffers that I work with in DC are not regularly going into their offices. I would say when they are in session, maybe about a third of the staff, the chief of staff, the legislative director will come in office. Everybody else, it's a little bit more sporadically at best. So I'm hopeful that maybe by fall we'll see some adjustments there. I do think that we will see a return to an environment where not only can lobbyists set appointments, but also opportunities for folks like the people on this call that take trips back to DC through the Farm Bureau or whoever. I think that will return, but it's a long ways from where we are at the moment. So I want to turn it back to Terry to hear if you have any general comments for us, Terry, and then also, the environmental issues was something I think that you were maybe going to touch on as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. I would start by saying, I think we spent a little time at the beginning, obviously talking about politics and the election cycles. Those are fun to talk about at some point in time, as you heard Chelsea and John both indicate. You've got to get down to the business of actually making decisions and debating policy, and that hopefully in some instances requires some amount of compromise. Given the numbers in most committees and especially on the federal level, that certainly requires compromise for where we are today, which creates an opportunity for us in the advocacy realms or in the association world to advance policy interests, even if you think that the dynamics are skewed against you. From an administration perspective, those tight margins really do create opportunities to advance agendas and initiatives. One of those probably comes in the space of environmental policy. Let me just talk a little. I think I drew the short straw on environmental policy because I'm not an environmental lawyer and try to run from these issues, right? But nonetheless, we'll talk about them tonight, right? So even back in the campaign, the Biden campaign was fairly clear and fairly consistent that if elected, climate and environmental issues would be a top priority for them. Since that election, they have begun a serious and significant conversation about ecosystem credits, carbon markets, carbon trading, all of that sorts of things. The transition team led by Robert Bonnie at USDA immediately started talking about using the CCC or the Commodity Credit Corporation. Those were the funds that the Trump administration originally used to do MFP payments in the first couple of rounds of those. So the Biden folks have been talking about using that same line of funding, that same funding mechanism to essentially build a carbon bank at USDA. Since Vilsack was confirmed and has gotten into position, there has not been a lot of development there. About the same time as that confirmation of the secretary, the administration, the president signed an executive order establishing the 30 by 30 initiative. That's the concept being that that by 2030, 30% of the land in the United States would be in some sort of conservation program. And depending on how you do that math, you can make the argument that we're already there when you look at federal lands, when you look at federal farm programs like CRP and other conservation programs, or even some of the other state level set aside programs. You can get to a 30% conservation number fairly quickly and fairly easily. I don't think that's probably I don't think that's the calculation that the Biden administration will use, but you can make the case. And there are probably some folks who may be starting to think that way already in our parts of the world. But there certainly has been significant interest. There have not been in either of those instances legislative proposals. So no text, no rules, no regulation, nothing that would really indicate where the administration intends to head here. What we do know is that they want to create these programs where farmers, where agriculture and forestry are given an opportunity to sequester carbon. We do that well already in agriculture, and one of the things that we'll look for in any proposal when they come is to make sure that agriculture is given the opportunity to get some form of credit for the good work that's already been done. Whether it's using no-till or cover crops or any of the other conservation practices we use in cropping rotations, or the good work that's done in grasslands and in other conservation programs in riparian buffers and any of those kinds of things, to make sure that work is recognized as part of the contribution that agriculture has already made to this effort. There are folks who would tell you out there that 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. The real data point is 9%. So don't believe everything you read on the internet. That's probably a talking point for later, but it's certainly one where we've got to clear up the myths about what the true contribution of agriculture is in greenhouse gas emissions and in the overall climate sort of situation. We do believe that there is an opportunity for the production agriculture community in this carbon market, whether that's in cooperative works that would aggregate credits that could be then sold to large corporations, some of which have indicated an interest in buying those credits to offset their own emissions. Microsoft has said that. McDonald's have made announcements about buying carbon credits from producers, from farmers and ranchers, in order to offset their emissions effort. What we have yet to see is a federally dictated or federally initiated program that would set up a mitigation bank or any kind of other mechanism to aggregate and form those markets. We have seen some entities, Indigo Ag, there's a couple of others that have started offering contracts to producers for credits. And we're attempting at the Farm Bureau anyway to get our hands on those contracts, because one of the most important parts of any of those efforts is making sure that producers understand the terms. So if any of you on the call today, it's a little commercial break, right? Have a contract or have seen one and you want to share that with us, we'd be happy to take a look at it and get that from you, because understanding those terms is an important part of moving forward here. The biggest unknown is really where this thing is headed at this point in time. There's a lot of talk and a lot of speculation. What is unknown is what the market looks like, what any of those aggregator programs look like, and really what the value is of sequestered carbon or banked carbon in some way. So for a producer to sell that today, it's just hard to figure out what it's worth. There's no basis, there's no market, there's no indication of that going forward. So we are continuing to watch that closely, knowing that there's a lot of development that has to occur at this point in time. Chelsea, looks like you're gonna add something.
I got a question for you on this topic. I think you follow it closer than I do, but I continually hear producers with concerns about past good practices. Somebody that went to no-till, because it was the right thing to do, and feels like they might not get compensated for something that they've done in the past. Is that going to be one of the challenging pieces of this whole conversation?
I think it is for a couple of reasons. We've got lots of good work in the history book, obviously, as you indicated, lots of folks who are on a daily basis very concerned and keyed in on soil health and on nutrient management and all those kinds of things. The first challenge is in quantifying what's been done and what's the value of that past effort, right? And then the second part that presents a challenge is probably in the concept of making sure that we don't get penalized for previous effort, but that so it may not be really more, it may not be about getting credit for that good work. It may be more about not starting at zero in terms of what agriculture has to do going forward. And whatever incentives, the federal government might create to do that, to do good work going forward, making sure that we recognize CRP has an impact and other federal conservation programs have had a significant impact on soil health and on nutrient management historically, and will continue to do so.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Chelsea, probably the other thing we should talk about in the environmental realm is the Waters of the U.S. rule, or the WOTUS rule. That's always a fun one for us at the Farm Bureau, and lots of folks. Kansas is in a unique position. John will nod and agree with this, maybe even explain what I'm not going to get right this evening, but we've had decades of real solid leadership in water quality and in making sure that our potential to pollute is mitigated, whether those come from nutrients applied to crops or from livestock operations that might be contributors or potential that would have a potential to pollute as well. We've got a lot of good track record in that space that really helped us back in the day when the Obama administration proposed the WOTUS rule, to say, wait a minute, we've done good work here. There's no need to over-regulate this part of the sector in terms of how agriculture contributes to pollutants in water and water quality via our streams and the waters that are designated as waters of the United States, or navigable waters in the country. So we fought that fight in the Obama administration. You had the Trump folks come to town and essentially rescind the Obama era rule and put into place a much more favorable rule related to water quality and production agriculture. And then the thing that always happens when you get lawyers involved. That's not to say anything bad about Chelsea or me or John or any other lawyer on the call, but there was a lot of litigation that happened after that, right? And so finally, just earlier this month, we got a favorable decision out of the 10th Circuit Court related to a stay that had been enacted in the state of Colorado, prohibiting enforcement or enactment of the WOTUS rule there. That was essentially the last hurdle, the last injunction that was in place on WOTUS at a national level. So in effect, the 10th Circuit removing that injunction allowed the rule to be fully implemented. That makes it significantly harder for a Biden administration EPA to walk it back or to change it in a significant way. The rulemaking process is a lot more significant process to go a different direction at this point in time. Now, that doesn't mean, and they've indicated, that they believe that WOTUS needs changed. We believe that Michael Reagan, who's the new administrator at EPA, understands the rule. He came from the State Department of Agriculture in North Carolina and has had other environmental roles there, and understands certainly the issues that are implicated here. But we do believe that there will be attempts made to weaken or to change the way that rule is implemented and was written by the Trump folks. So continuing to watch that. There are likely to be regulatory changes, but there are also likely to be litigation challenges that come up as well that we'll continue to watch and be engaged in to make sure producers end up in the right place on that front as well.
Thanks, Terry. I think that's a really good overview of kind of what seems to be the topic of the day. It doesn't matter what the question is, especially in DC at the moment. The answer is climate change. And so appreciate hearing your perspective on some of those things and where it could be headed. Rural vitality is another thing we had on kind of our bucket list of what are the hot topics we're hearing a lot about at the moment. John, Terry, kick it over to the two of you to talk about what sorts of things are we hearing about in the rural vitality space, especially as it comes to Kansas.
Yeah, I'll take first stab at this, I guess. Terry, feel free to add in. And I know we got a lot of stuff to talk about. I didn't realize we had this much stuff to talk about. I'll keep this brief. I kind of talked about broadband. I think that's probably the number one key issue that we have to think about from a rural vitality issue. I think we need to to continue to beat that drum and continue to explain, it's going to take a large investment to truly get adequate rural broadband out there. But that's definitely one of the main things that we're continuing to work on. Rural housing, that's a difficult issue to resolve. I don't know, I can't think of the right verb here, but it's proven to be difficult. It's proven to be difficult for years and years and years. We've known we've had a rural housing issue. So we're constantly looking at ideas there. I don't think we've even gotten close to the silver bullet. And I don't know if it exists, but that's a major topic of conversation. But the other thing that I would say from a rural vitality standpoint, and I'll one of the questions is the main issues that we might not be focused on for 10 to 15 years down the road. And I know Ron in the chat has a question about bridging the gap between rural and the rural urban divide. And I think this is the issue this is the one that keeps me awake at night. And that's property taxes and how we're going to continue to fund state and local governments. Specifically, it's right now, we in the agriculture community, the last 7 or 8 years, I mean, we constantly at Farm Bureau and here at our office constantly get calls and questions of people that are just can't believe how much their property tax valuations have went up. Well, honestly, what my bigger fear is as we move forward and we work through some of those high profitable years of agriculture out of our 8-year rolling average, as we do that and we start having a shift downward, these local units of government in the rural areas have really relied on that ag land to fund a lot of their projects, their governance. And as we move away and those valuations potentially decrease or at worst, worst or best, depending on your perspective, plateau, we have that just puts more pressure. If those valuations decrease, that puts more pressure on your businesses and your commercial property and your residential property. And that push and pull is going to come to a head someday. And at the same time, if you look 15 years down the road, we will have been redistricted twice. Rural representation will be even lower. So that is the issue that I think the agricultural community has to realize, that, they may get frustrated with some of the intricacies of the valuation process, but it's extremely important that we not forget the big picture and not create internal fights, because if we do that, then rural representation with a more urban legislature in 15 years, we will lose any ability to maintain the property tax valuations and the systems that we have to fund our state and local governments, schools, et cetera. So that's what I worry about from a rural vitality perspective. And it's kind of, like I say, it goes to the question that we received of what are we not focused on? And I'm focused on it all the time, but I'm a tax policy nerd, and I actually enjoy these conversations. No one else likes to listen to them, but I still talk about it. But those are the things that worry me more than a one-off rural economic development bill that may or may not work. We've seen hundreds of those over the years. And I think it's the tax policy and it's maintaining those relationships with urban legislators. That's the key for rural vitality. That's the John Donley opinion. Terry, you're at least nodding your head up and down, so I hope you agree.
Yeah, John, I'd agree completely. I think the property tax discussion, it's a hard one to have with, our urban cousins, because it gets wonky really quick. And I none of us can explain it as well as John can, in sentences that are comprehensible. But I think it's one where agricultural and rural communities have to make an effort in the educational lane to make sure that Kansans in general understand how property taxes form really the foundation of our tax structure, right? That they are, and John would tell you this as well. I think, we get calls frequently from members of the Farm Bureau who say, man, tax bills are so high, we need to go to Topeka and fix this. The answer really is not a Topeka answer. It's really a county government issue. The bulk of those property tax dollars are collected and funneled to fund local government, cities and counties, townships, et cetera. So there's a lot of education to be done across the board in terms of understanding why that structure is important, but also where those dollars are going and what they're paying for. And then I think as Kansans, we've got to continue to have the conversations about, are those services, our local school districts, local, road departments, all of those things, are those important things that we want to continue to fund? We think we know the answers. And I'd probably add to that list of rural vitality issues, the issue of rural healthcare, hospitals, access to quality care, doctors in rural communities. All of those are ones where, if we intend to have folks living across the state of Kansas like we have for the last 150 or so years, we've got to continue to answer those questions about how we provide those services, but how we do it in a way that doesn't create an overly burdensome tax bill for landowners, property owners, business owners in those rural communities.
I think that makes a lot of sense and gives folks a lot of things to think about as they think about our rural communities and how we continue to have good vitality there for years to come. I have on my list just 3 more topics that I just feel like we would be remiss if we didn't hit on at least a little bit. I want to hear Terry talk a little bit about trade. I want to mention some competition issues. And then I think John was going to touch on labor for us a little bit, and then we'll go to kind of a question and answer and breakout component. So Terry, do you want to hit on trade?
Yeah, real quickly. And before I do that, Chelsea, I'll answer Steve's questions in the question in the chat about cellular service and broadband. There really are 2 separate lanes in that space. There's rural mobile broadband, and then there's fiber or fixed wireless broadband to houses. They both get improved when you talk about overall broadband build out and distribution, but there are 2 separate federal funding sources. One's for mobile, one's for fixed wireless or for fiber. And they're both important. As you all know, we frequently tell folks that you've got to have wired or fixed wireless fiber service to the farmstead, but equally important is mobile service in the field. 1, it's a safety issue, but also 2, as we continue to implement and build out precision agriculture technology, we've got to have significant and solid up and down speeds to get that data moving from the tractor or the combine to the cloud, and to be able to use those tools that are available to the industry today that can help us do a better job environmentally and in lots of other ways of precision farming and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully that was helpful. Okay, thumbs up, good deal. So shifting to trade, we'd also be remiss a bit if we didn't acknowledge the really good work. You can't go wrong when you can put the farm kid from Jewell County in the seat as the top agricultural trade negotiator. We had a lot of good work done by Ambassador Greg Dowd over the last several years in the Trump administration. Great progress. If you ever get the opportunity, many of you probably have had to hear him tell the stories about negotiating the phase 1 deal with China. It's worth the price of admission, however much that is, because it's just a great conversation with one of our own that was really fun to have him in that seat for a while. So the good news is we made a lot of great progress in a lot of areas that we needed to make significant progress on. If you watch those numbers of exports, you continue to see China buying in the market. And you probably saw as well, or heard as well, last week, Catherine Tai, Chelsea mentioned earlier, was confirmed unanimously by the Senate in that same slot that Greg had. She has a solid reputation for saying the right things and for a commitment to continuing the efforts to force or to compel compliance by our trading partners to the agreements that we have in place, and to continue to move forward on those new agreements. So we think that's good and are optimistic about what that means. The administration has said they'll continue to enforce the phase 1 agreement with China and to continue to push for additional agreements, additional moves in the path to continue to expand those markets. You have probably seen movement in the last week. It's been reported about movement on phase 2 with Japan and that agreement. That's good, especially for beef exports to those markets. there are indications that the new administration is interested in re-entering the conversation on the successor to TPP. So that would be the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, because we like to make acronyms and new names for things. So that's positive as well. We think those markets, certainly from an agricultural perspective, the TPP agreement originally as presented was one that would have been helpful to us, and it was worth pursuing. Even today, continues to be so. We filed this week, I believe, or late last week, challenges on the dairy provisions against Canada in USMCA, the new NAFTA. So there's enforcement happening in those realms as well by the new administration, which is good news. They have also signaled intent, both from the US end of things, but also from the UK end of things, to continue the negotiations on an agreement, expanding opportunities for agriculture there. So overall, fairly optimistic on the trade front. I think we continue to see positive movement there. Probably the most important note on that front is that Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA, that authority for the administration expires on July 1st of this year. That's congressional authorized authority to the administration that has to be extended or reaffirmed by Congress. So that's going to become an important action point for us in agriculture going forward. So I'd stop there, Chelsea. We think it's fairly positive at this point, and momentum continues to be signaled, at least from the administration.
That's definitely good to hear, Terry. And I echo your comments that listening to former Ambassador Dowd tell some of those stories is time really well spent. And we'll give just a little bit of a pitch. National Institute of Animal Agriculture is having a virtual conference, I think a month from today, April 21st through 23rd. And I know that we're going to see Ambassador Dowd and former Ambassador Vetter in a panel discussion there. I know Dowd's going to share some of those stories. I'm curious to hear some of the back and forth perspectives, having, been ambassadors under different administrations. I'm really looking forward to that at the National Institute of Animal Ag's virtual conference in about a month. The next thing we wanted to mention was competition issues. And I think competition and consolidation are really tough issues in a lot of different industries. We're seeing it in big tech, but we're seeing it even more so in agriculture. And I think probably the area that this seems to be the most white hot in agriculture is in the meat packing sector. You saw a lot of frustration from producers about the spread. You probably started even pre-COVID when we saw the Holcomb, Kansas packing plant fire of the Tyson plant. And that was about 7% of the processing capacity came offline. We saw a pretty significant spread between the live cattle price, or what packers were paying feed yards for cattle, and the box beef price, and what retailers or restaurants were paying the packer. We saw a historic spread there in 2019. It didn't hold its record very long because we saw a much more historic spread following COVID-19 and some of the packing plant shuttering issues that we had. So this has really led to a couple different concerns that has a lot of congressional interest at the moment. One is there too much consolidation? You've got 4 companies that have about 84% of the marketplace in beef packing. I'll share with you that those same 4 companies have had 79% or more of the marketplace since the early 90s. So probably the consolidation itself is not brand new, but certainly some of the frustrations seem to be pretty raw at the moment. I think that the conversations about just supply chain as well have gotten pretty heated, and I'll tell you that this is the number one thing when I talk to members of Congress, that they are looking for solutions and really wanting feedback. I think one challenge they're having, though, is they're getting different feedbacks from different folks in the livestock sector. We are notorious for not always being on the same page. So that's certainly been a challenge for some of our congressional partners. I think that there is certainly a consensus that we do need more shackle space. When I say shackle space, I'm talking about just packing plant capacity, more hooks to get cattle killed. And if you look at the economic analysis on this, and we saw USDA do a study, we've seen some good studies from independent researchers, Farm Bureau put a study out. Most of those studies will indicate that we have a leverage problem where kind of from 2010 to 2014, we lost quite a few of our beef processors that not whole companies necessarily going out of business, but individual facilities shutting down because our cow herd was at a low level. Well, we had drought and things going into that created that. We've been good at retaining heifers and building up our cow herd, and now probably we're in a situation where we need the processing space more than those packers might need the cattle. We got a pre-question that I thought was a good one that asked, okay, we've heard an announcement in the last week about a new plant in Nebraska that's going to open up. There's been rumors of folks interested in doing something in Kansas. The Tama, Iowa plant that National Beef has announced just last week that it was going to expand its capacity and its slaughter. And the question was asked, if all of those things come to fruition, will we increase our shackle space too much? And I leaned on my favorite ag economist, who's also my dad at Cattle Facts, and looking at that question, and the answer, at least from their perspective at the moment, is not yet. That you could still see positive packer margins, not nearly as high as they are at the moment, but even if you get all of those things online, that there would still be the ability to have some profitability in our packing sector, even with that much increased capacity. On a congressional standpoint, we've seen a ton of different bills introduced, on things that people think would improve packing capacity, whether it be grants, whether it be trying to make it easier to ship meat across state lines. There's a lot of different philosophies out there. We've also seen some federal investigations. Department of Justice did confirm that they were investigating the beef packers. Haven't seen any results out of that. I think that you can read into that. If DOJ doesn't find anything, they're not going to say anything. Now, that is different than what we've seen in the poultry and pork space. And I think one of the reasons we have seen a difference there is, at least in poultry, there was an in-between entity, AgriStats, that the poultry processors were utilizing to share business information, and pretty in-depth business information. Things like their number of chicks coming up and things like that. We've seen that on the poultry side. I haven't seen any evidence of that on the beef side. That has not changed the fact that you still have some legislators interested in making some adjustments to cattle marketing. And probably the most notable is Senator Grassley had a bill last Congress called the 5014 bill that would require that 50% of cattle be sold in the cash market or negotiated trade, as opposed to other ways of selling cattle that have become more popular for fed cattle in recent decades, like putting them on a formula contract. That Grassley bill would have mandated that each plant sell 50% in the cash, or buy 50% in the cash. I anticipate that bill's going to drop again tomorrow. That rumor has been out a time or two over the last couple of weeks. We think it's actually real this time, that Senator Grassley is going to reintroduce that 5014 bill this week. Another bill that has already been reintroduced, it's a little bit of a different perspective on this, would be Senator Fisher of Nebraska has a Cattle Markets Transparency Act. It does 4 different things. It would create a contract library where people could go and see what are these deals between feed yards and packers. Personal information would be redacted, but just get a better idea of what is out there in the marketplace in some of these formula contracts. It would increase the number of days that the packers would have to be reporting their committed cattle from 7 to 14. It would encourage USDA to report more information by doing something different with their confidentiality guidelines, although figuring out what something different looks like is going to be really tough. I'll tell you that the lamb industry and the sheep industry has been working on their confidentiality issues for quite some time, and they haven't found easy solutions there. The final thing that Fisher Cattle Market Transparency Act bill would do is it would direct USDA to do studies on what is a significant percentage of cash trade to get robust price discovery by region. And then there would be a rulemaking process where the USDA would propose minimum cash trade levels that people would have an opportunity to provide feedback on, and then eventually would probably go into place. So those are some of the high points on the competition topics. We could talk all night and for many, many more weeks on those pieces, but happy to take questions or anything offline if anybody wants to go really in the weeds on one of those things. I do want to hear John's thoughts on labor as well before we just open it up for questions in general.
Yeah, we probably need to apologize. I didn't think our list was this extensive. I didn't think we'd fill up an hour. Anyways, I'm going to make this very brief. On the labor side, obviously at the federal level, the union and labor influence will have a strong influence on the decisions of the Biden administration. And you'll see a lot of that through some of the employee safety and worker protections that we're likely to see. The other issue that I have some hope that we may be able to find some bipartisan solutions to. I'm guessing it's misplaced hope, but I do have some. And that's the immigration issue. I think, from an agriculture perspective, we need that stable legal workforce. But it's proven to be, the immigration reform at the federal level, which everyone knows we need to have, has proven to be a very difficult task, mainly because of the narrative through the elections. But I would say this last election, it wasn't quite as vocal from either side. So I'm hopeful that the both parties will reach a point where they believe, or they no longer believe, that they need immigration out there as a talking point, and we can have real conversations on immigration reform. And my middle name is not Pollyanna, but I'm afraid that might be a little Pollyanna-ish. But I am hopeful. I think that the environment, the time is ripe. It's overdue for immigration reform. And until we have that, we don't solve the issue. The status quo is what we have. And, from some in the agricultural community, the status quo works. You just have to know how to work with it. So I think that's my hope on labor, that we'll see something come out of that. And Chelsea, you may think maybe I'm totally crazy, but I am hopeful that will occur. Time will tell, obviously. So, but I'll leave it at that on the labor front. I do think probably people may want to ask some questions and get some dialogue started here. So I'll pause and be quiet. I will say on the water issues, there's some questions that were here before. Maybe the best way to handle that is, if you want to talk what's been going on water at the State House level, maybe go to my breakout and we'll spend a little bit of time on it there. But it might be the easiest way, because I don't want to, I've already bored all of you with property tax policy. I don't need to bore you with water policy as well. Only those that are gluttons for punishment will go to my breakout.
If you do want to go to breakout and talk about water, can you put that in your chat? And I'll try to make sure, John, that they get to your room.
John cares about really important, but also dry issues.
It's my personality.
The water joke.
Hey, I didn't know if we, before we go on to our breakouts, if any of you wanted to speak to the discussions about the estate tax and kind of what you're hearing about that and some of the implications. And then also, Terry, you touched on this a little bit, but another note, what can we do on a local level to be proactive with our local governments as individuals in our respective locations? And, what kind of conversations should we be having on a local level with our leadership here?
I can give you the 30,000-foot view on the estate tax. Bills have been filed in both chambers, Senate and House, to repeal the estate tax. At this point in time, there will be a discussion. We are not Pollyanna-ish on that topic at all. Unlike the stuff John likes to think about, we couldn't get the estate tax repealed in a Republican House, Republican Senate, Congress a few years ago. It's not going to happen a lot likely to happen in the current environment, and probably from our perspective, the bigger issues, more important than estate tax, would be the other tax policy implications that are important for agriculture and for operators. Those would be Section 179, the other expensing tools that you have to use on your operations. And more importantly, when it comes to estate planning, that stepped up basis in capital gains taxes, that becomes important. We believe that, with those tools in place, most families can navigate the estate tax challenge. We'd love to repeal it. Don't get me wrong and hear me say anything other than that. But stepped up basis and the other expensing tools, depreciation tools, are far more important to agriculture and to passing on a family farm in a way that doesn't result in something that's harmful to the overall operation than that repeal is at this point in time. So while we know those bills are out there and clearly think they're okay, we're focused on making sure that members understand the implications on the other side of that tax equation. That's not just estate tax. It's much bigger than that. Did I get that, Chelsea, John?
I think you nailed it.
Okay. So then really, Susan, to your question about local engagement, this is a Farm Bureau speech, so I'll just make it quickly for you. We believe that local engagement is one of the most important things that producers, citizens, members of organizations can do, regardless of their political affiliation or their beliefs. Understanding what local governments do is important. They're taxing you sometimes to death or not, but they're taxing you a lot, right? They're also contemplating what can sometimes be really onerous and disastrous zoning schemes and other regulations on operations. We've heard and seen some crazy stuff in county governments, even in the state of Kansas, related to agricultural zoning and land use planning and all those kinds of things. So being engaged at a local level, knowing your county commissioners. If you want to run for county commissioner, we'd love to talk to you about that, or the school board, or any of those kinds of things, right? Engagement matters, and oftentimes local engagement is really what makes the biggest difference in how government touches and affects our lives. So I'll stop with that commercial break. And Susan, hopefully that's the answer you were looking for.
Now that Terry has done a commercial break for Farm Bureau, which I certainly don't object to with my history with Farm Bureau, I would like to say that if you do want to get involved locally, there's no better place to get that learning than through the Kansas Agriculture and Rural Leadership Program. And you can really go to your local leaders and serve on the school board and all the other places and really have an impact. Right, Terry?
Absolutely. Yeah. John will be applying for the next class, actually.
We appreciate that. Does anyone want to speak to the 30 by 30 initiative in any more detail than you have already?
I will add this, Terry. I think you hit on the topic earlier, but I think it's really important that we not let social media, and this is actually another question, and big tech shape our opinions. While it's an issue that's out there, there's a lot bigger issues that we need to be dealing with than worrying about some idea, esoteric idea at this point. So that's my overly aggressive answer to that one. Maybe I need to be giving it more thought, but I haven't yet because it's not real yet. So I'll leave it at that, and feel free to shoot arrows at me through the screen if someone wants to.
Jill, could I ask a general question?
Absolutely, sir.
This is a little bit off topic and mostly geared towards Chelsea because you're working on the federal level, but the other two are welcome to chime in. We saw the Democrats ram through that $1.9 trillion Nancy Pelosi payback bill. There are more in the pipeline, an infrastructure bill coming, many other tax and spend, far left liberal legislation coming down the pike. What do you think the odds are, or the chances of the Republicans, primarily, of course, in the Senate, of stopping some of this crap?
You know, Steve, I think that a thin margin matters, particularly in the Senate. And I think procedural issues, as not sexy as they are, also matter, particularly in the Senate. There really are, under current rules, few opportunities to pass bills with just 50 votes. Typically in the Senate, you're going to need 60 votes in order to file cloture and get a procedure in place in order to get something voted on. Maybe I'm being Pollyanna here, like John, but I've got quite a bit of belief that we're going to continue to see at least some form of that 60 requirement remain in place. Not for everything. There are, a couple more opportunities that could probably be massive bills, but I think that we're going to have to see some compromising to get to that 60 number on a lot of topics, and hopefully that's going to require a little bit more back and forth. And candidly, and this is not a comment about Democrats, it's a comment about going too far in any one direction. If you see, it's a pendulum, and if we see the board get run too far one direction or another, we tend to see results in elections that kind of swings the pendulum back the other direction. And I think throughout history we've been able to see that in both directions, and that's kind of my philosophical thought behind that. I think that 60 votes matters. And even if something goes too far one direction, that elections, election opportunities will be presented.
Yeah, Steve, I'd agree with Chelsea on that front. 60 votes matters, and I think some of it in some form or fashion remains in one way or another. I would also point you to there's a group of 10 Republicans that Moran is among them. There are several others who have attempted to bridge the gap and create a negotiating position with Democrats. I think that group is worth watching and continuing to look at the way they approach the compromise on some of those things. They become the bridge to 60 for Democrats to get to filibuster proof or cloture votes going forward. So at some point they're going to have to be listened to, and compromises are going to have to be made. Had they been listened to in this last COVID relief effort, the $1.4 trillion bill, it would have been 2/3 less expensive or something significantly less expensive. So there are folks attempting to create the bargaining position to get a better outcome going forward, especially in the Senate.
Okay, thank you both.
I'm not sure. I haven't seen any other questions. And I'm not sure if anyone else has questions to the whole group, or if we can just go directly to breakouts.